Welcome back, everyone. I hope you're doing well. We got another fun video called The Real Reasons European Colonialism Was Possible. A Premodernist. We've seen a few of his videos. This is always fun to kind of like stretch our imagination and understand things in a different perspective. I obviously think that this was the turn of the 1453 event where Constantinople was captured by Ottomans, which turned for a different route to the East Indies. Now, I'd love to hear the reasons it was possible, which might be due to like mercantilism and like really about nationalism and beating your opponents. But let's jump right in. Hit that like button. I appreciate you. Let's go.
In this video, I'm going to answer three questions. First of all, why were the Europeans able to colonize North and South America in the 1500s? Secondly, why did they not also conquer Africa and Asia at the same time? And then third, why is it that later on in the late 1800s, they suddenly were able to colonize Africa and Asia?
Three good questions. I don't have the answers to either. I could guess, but I don't want to guess. I want to hear my man, Mr. Premodernist.
So first of all, that first question, why were the Europeans able to conquer North and South America? It's not what a lot of people think. A lot of people think that the Europeans were able to colonize the Americas because they had better technology. And that's not really true. The Europeans did have some technologies that the indigenous peoples did not have. So
Like gunpowder.
they had ironworking, they had gunpowder weapons, but those things in and of themselves were not sufficient. There are actually a lot of myths surrounding the European colonization of the Americas. I'm not really going to get into them in this video. There are myths like the Aztecs were overawed by the Spanish. They thought the Spanish were gods. They were scared of the horses that the Spanish brought. All that's not true. The Europeans were able to colonize the Americas not because they had better technology, but because they had diseases that the people of the Americas did not have resistance to. Because back in the Eastern Hemisphere, people had lived alongside domesticated animals. And when you live alongside other species in very close proximity, sometimes diseases will jump from some other species, from your livestock, to humans.
Pigs, fleas, fleas on rats, fleas on cats. In a Dr. Seuss book. I'm going to stop.
By and large, humans in the Western Hemisphere did not live alongside animals in close proximity. And that meant there were fewer
Is that true? Like, Native Americans didn't have dogs?
pathogens jumping from other species to humans in North and South America. So they had fewer diseases. When the Europeans and the Africans came to the Americas, they brought with them the pathogens that existed in Europe and Africa. And they came to the Americas where the people had never encountered these diseases before, and the indigenous people of the Americas died in very large numbers. During the first 150 years after European contact, roughly between the years 1500 and 1650, the indigenous population of the Americas declined by 90%.
Ah. And probably a lot of that's just smallpox, different fevers, like typhoid, amongst other things.
It was 10% in 1650, what it had been in 1500. So because the indigenous population was so devastated by the pathogens brought over from the Eastern Hemisphere, that made it possible for the Europeans to colonize North and South America. Note here the technological issue. When the Europeans went to the Americas in the 1600s, they did have certain technologies the natives didn't have, but those technologies were 16th and 17th century technologies. And it was not a huge jump for the native peoples to acquire those technologies for themselves. So the Europeans brought horses with them to the Americas. And then the natives adopted horses into their cultures and used horses themselves. The Europeans brought firearms to the Western Hemisphere. And then the natives could acquire guns, and then the natives used guns against the Europeans. But things changed in the 1800s. So this brings me to the third question, which is why was it that all of a sudden in the 1800s, the Europeans were able to conquer Africa and Asia? All right, so let's recap here. So the Europeans arrived in the Americas in the 1500s. Spanish.
Wasn't the Ottoman Empire a huge part of this question? And the decline of them and the expanding technology, the European colonies allowed them to supersede them?
And Portuguese. Then in the 1600s, the English, the Dutch, and the French came to the Americas. They ruled over the Americas during the 1700s, and then at the end of the 1700s and during the early 1800s, most of the colonies in the Western Hemisphere became independent republics. And then there's a gap. And then in the middle of the 19th century, the Europeans began colonizing Africa and Asia. Mm-hmm. So the first question I was going to answer was, why were the Europeans able to colonize the Americas? And the answer is basically diseases. The second question that I was going to answer was, why were they not able to conquer Africa and Asia at the same time that they conquered the Americas? And the answer is diseases. The Africans and the Asians had the same diseases the Europeans had.
Oh.
And also, they had the same technology the Europeans had, for what it's worth. The Europeans were not superior technologically to everyone else in the world.
Gunpowder obviously was created in China. So a ton, I mean, give it, the East Indies were colonized, so we don't want to leave that out. Like Asia, when we say Asia, I think he's specifically speaking more on like Indian, Chinese, and a lot of the countries in Eastern Asia, but like the Indies, like Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, those have been conquered and colonized for a while now, once we get to the 1850s. Africa, I'm not sure of the stories of Africa, but there are Dutch colonies and Portuguese colonies and English colonies all throughout the western side of Africa, but not like in mass of like how the French began with Algeria, and then English with the Rhodesia, and etc., etc.
And this is a misconception I come across sometimes. People have this idea that the Europeans were somehow super advanced in the year 1500 compared to everyone else, and they just went around blowing everybody away. That's not true. The Europeans were not more advanced than the other Asian and African kingdoms. When the Portuguese were visiting the
when we say African kingdoms, though, we got to be specific. Sub-Saharan African kingdoms were nowhere near advanced as the the European kingdoms. Now, above Sahara, when we talk about like the caliphates and the Ottoman Empire and the Mediterranean-based countries, those, yeah. But I don't think the sub-Saharan countries and nations and people were anywhere close to the Europeans, were they?
African kingdoms in the late 1400s. They were interacting with them as equals. And they would talk about them like, here's another kingdom. This is the kingdom of Congo, and you know, we're a kingdom and they're a kingdom. And that was the attitude they had at that time.
Congo is sub-Saharan. Interesting.
It was only later on that the Europeans got an attitude of massive superiority toward the Africans. Okay, so now I come to the third question, which is, why is it that the Europeans were able to colonize Africa and Asia in the late 1800s? And the answer now is technology. Now it is.
Fire rate has increased for weapons. There's nothing mechanized at this point. Artillery is a huge thing.
Because what changed was, beginning in the late 1700s, the Industrial Revolution started happening. And then it got into full swing during the 1800s. And the Industrial Revolution was huge. It is the most significant, most consequential thing that has happened to the human race in 10,000 years. Because it dramatically changed everything about how we live our lives, about everything, about how war is done, but not just war, about how the economy works, about what kinds of jobs we work, about what kind of lifestyle we have. Everything, if you look around in your daily life, every single thing that's there in your daily life is there because of industrialization, and would not be there if it had not been for industrialization.
Sure.
It's
you guys are watching this on a phone or on a tablet or on a computer. These are all metallized and plastic materials that are mass produced in an industrial format.
Easy to overlook how important industrialization was. Industrialization meant that people found new energy sources, specifically the energy source of steam energy. And they were able to use steam energy to do things that people couldn't do before because they hadn't had enough energy to do it. They could make steel bridges and steel ships. They can make all kinds of stuff out of steel now. They could also
God, that looks dangerous.
machine guns, like make guns at higher precision than before. So they can make the guns more effective.
Faster.
And this is the real breakthrough in firearms technology.
Whoa.
Was with industrialization. And also steam power could be used for transportation. You could power trains now, and you can make ships go faster than before. So that gave the Europeans an enormous advantage over everyone else who had not yet gone through industrialization. So there is this brief window of time during the late 1800s and during the 1900s when Europeans and people of European descent had industrial technology and the rest of the world was still trying to catch up. And so there's this narrow window of time in which Europeans were uber powerful compared to everyone else. And that allowed the Europeans to go around and dominate the rest of the world. This is a recent phenomenon. This is something that comes out of the 1800s, and it's because of the fact that industrialization happened in Europe. And now the rest of the world is catching up. But because the Europeans got that early advantage, they got the head start, that locked in a structural advantage for Europe.
Hey, look at the British influence there, guys. Oh, they got the Falkland Islands at the bottom. They got Canada. I forget what country is that. Suriname? Plus, like, they have the Gambia, the Senegal, Nigeria, South Africa, Egypt, Ghana, and a lot of this, India, parts of China, New Guinea, tons of just so much land.
And people of European descent ever since then.
Italian, yeah, forget Italian was part of Somalia, parts of Libya.
And it locked in a global industrial economy.
The United States, of course, our little brief pre-1900 imperialistic empire of Guam, Hawaii. You can even say, I mean, you got Hawaii here. You got to say Alaska too. Well, yeah, you got to say Alaska too. You got Cuba, the Philippines. Crazy.
Where some countries are the producers of finished manufactured goods, and other countries are the suppliers of raw materials to those factories.
And we see that to today, like so many times. Like in China's probably the biggest exporter of material, raw material out of Africa, for example. Like all the mines that are the lithium mines that create lithium batteries. There's just so much raw material out of Africa that is just being siphoned. The wealth is being siphoned to developed nations. Like China, like the United States, like other places as well.
And there's this power differential and economic differential between different regions of the world now. Now, back in the 1800s, the Europeans were the first ones to industrialize. They were the first ones to take advantage of this military technology. And then they used that on the Africans and the Asians. Mm-hmm. And then in that way, they were able to conquer the countries of Africa and Asia and colonize them. Meanwhile, in the Americas, those colonies had become independent republics in the early 1800s, but they still functionally served as colonies to Europe. So even though they were nominally independent, they had a subservient relationship to Europe that was created by the Industrial Revolution. Because in Central and South America, they served as suppliers of raw materials for the factories of Europe. Now, in North America, they went through industrialization at the same time the Europeans did. And so,
well, it happened first, obviously, in the UK, but then, yeah.
So they were actually on the beneficiary side of the Industrial Revolution rather than the subservient supplier side of it. And not understanding this timeline can lead to some misunderstandings about how the history played out. All right, so that'll do it for me. Thanks.
Wow. What a insightful video by Mr. Premodernist himself. Interesting points made. Firstly, disease was a pro and a con to how you can attack. You have the same diseases, that's a con because now you can invade. If you don't, that's a pro for you because now you can invade and you can. It's basically biological warfare at that point. 90% is insane. I didn't know it was that high. Incredible. It's incredible how history has all these mysteries, and a lot. I think a lot of people already know this though, but and then the last part, the technological boom out of the Industrial Revolution, really created a hierarchy of nations based off of technological advancement in some of these fields. So insane to see. Thank you guys so much for joining me today. Leave me a video recommendation down below. I'll catch you guys next time. Peace out. Bye bye.